The night was dark and the wind was cold and sharp rain fell like broken glass from the sky. The forest was silent except for the sound of wet leaves. A girl walked slowly between the trees with heavy feet. Her skin was pale and her eyes were glowing. Softly in the dark, she was not human, but she looked almost human. Her clothes were torn and her hands were shaking. She was bleeding from her shoulder and her leg. Every step hurt, but she did not stop. She had to keep moving because they were chasing her. She could hear machines in the sky and voices on radios. They wanted to take her back, but she would rather die than go back. She had escaped a lab 2 days ago and had not eaten since then. She had not slept and her body was weak, but something inside her told her to go north. There was a signal and a light in her mind. It led her to a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The place looked old and forgotten. There was no fence and no lights, but she felt something safe there. She walked to the door and knocked with the last of her strength. The door opened slowly and a man stood there. He had a calm face and tired eyes. He looked at her but said nothing. She looked at him and fell to her knees. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked like dry leaves. "I have nothing to give, but if you want, I can." She looked down ashamed. The man bent down and looked into her glowing eyes. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He said, "Rest first." She wanted to cry, but she had no tears left. She felt warm for the first time in days. He helped her inside the cabin and sat her on a soft chair. The place was simple and clean. There was a fire in the fireplace and it smelled like old wood. He brought her a bowl of soup and bread. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He only said, "You look tired." She ate slowly and watched him. He moved like a soldier, but his hands were gentle. He did not ask her name or where she came from. She did not tell him that she was not from Earth, that she had crashed here 6 months ago with others, that the humans found them and took them, that they did tests and took her memories. She did not tell him any of that because something told her he already knew. After eating, she felt sleepy but afraid. He saw it and said, "You can sleep here tonight. No one will find you." She did not know why, but she believed him. She closed her eyes and fell into deep sleep. For the first time in days, the man stood near the window and looked outside. His face changed. His eyes were not tired anymore. They were watching the trees with sharp focus. He walked to a drawer and opened it. Inside was a small black device with a red light blinking. He touched the screen and words appeared. "Target located." He closed the drawer and looked at the girl sleeping peacefully. He whispered to himself, "Not again. Not this time." The morning came with soft light falling through the old wooden window. The girl opened her eyes slowly, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The pain returned quickly like a wave, but it was softer now. The coat around her shoulders was still warm and smelled like fire and dust. She looked around the cabin and saw the man sitting by the fireplace. With a mug in his hands, he was looking into the flames like they held a memory. She sat up slowly and he looked at her with calm eyes. "You slept," he said in a voice that was quiet but strong. She nodded and said, "Thank you." He stood and walked to a shelf, then took out a small box and brought it to her. Inside were clean bandages, some kind of cream, and a cloth. He sat down across from her and said, "Let me see your arm." She hesitated but then moved her torn sleeve up. The wound was worse than she thought. He cleaned it with care and no words. His hands moved like he had done this before many times. She wanted to ask who he was and why he was helping her, but she stayed silent. When he was done, he handed her a cup of warm water. She drank it and closed her eyes for a moment. "You are not afraid of me?" she asked. He said, "I have seen worse." That answer made her more curious, but she felt too tired to ask more. She looked at the wall where an old photo hung. It showed the same man, younger, in a uniform with a group of other soldiers. They all had the same look in their eyes, not proud, not happy, just silent. She turned back to him and said, "They will come for me." He nodded and said, "I know. Then why are you helping me?" she asked again. This time he answered, "Because you are not the enemy." She did not know how to answer that. She had spent months running and hiding and being hunted like an animal. This was the first time someone saw her and did not try to hurt her. She stood and walked to the small window and looked outside. The forest was still wet from the rain and the clouds were still heavy. There was something about this place that felt strange, not unsafe, but different. She turned and asked, "What is this place?" The man looked up and said, "Just a cabin," but his eyes told another story. He walked to a corner of the room and opened a hidden panel in the floor. She stepped closer and saw machines below, glowing lights, wires, tools, weapons she had only seen in research labs. He said, "I built it when I left the program." "What program?" she asked. He paused for a second and then said, "The one that made people like you." Her body froze and her breath caught in her chest. She stepped back and stared at him with wide eyes. "You were one of them," she whispered. "I was," he said, "but I left when I saw what they were doing." He looked at her, not with guilt but with something else, like a promise he had made long ago. She sat down again and tried to make sense of everything he handed her. A small device with a light that pulsed softly. "Keep this with you. If anything happens, press it and I will come." She held it in her hand and nodded. Outside, a bird cried loudly and flew across the trees. The wind changed and he stood up suddenly. He walked to the window and stared at the sky. "Something is coming," he said. He moved quickly to a cupboard and took out a strange weapon. It was not human-made. She looked at it and then at him. "Where did you get that?" she asked. He said, "I took it from the base before I left." Her heart beat faster. She knew that weapon. It was part of the same tech used to track her kind. She stood and walked slowly to the door. "They will find us," she said. "Then let them come," he replied. He opened a drawer and pressed A hidden button outside near the trees. Small towers rose silently from the ground. A faint hum filled the air. She felt the charge in the wind and looked at him with new eyes. "You are not just a man living alone, are you?" He said no and turned back. To the fire the flames danced and shadows moved across the walls. He looked at her and said, "You should sleep again while you can." She wanted to trust him, but fear still lived inside her. Still she lay down and held the small device close to her chest. The man stayed awake and watched the shadows. He knew what was coming. Not just soldiers, but something darker. He closed his eyes for a second and whispered, "Not again, not this time." The sun was hidden behind gray clouds and the air smelled like rain and metal. The girl sat on the edge of the small bed, her fingers touching the silver device the man had given her. She looked at it again and again, trying to understand what made him care. No human had ever shown her kindness, not without a reason, but he did not ask for anything, not her name, not her secrets, not her past. He only watched the trees and listened to the wind as if the forest was speaking to him. She walked into the main room and found him sitting at the table fixing a piece of strange machinery. Wires and parts were scattered in front of him, but his hands moved like he had done this 1,000 times. She asked him, "What are you doing?" and he said, Preparing for what?" she asked, and he said, "They are coming." Her chest tightened and she felt her heart beat faster. She said, "I can run again. I do not want to bring danger here." But he looked at her and said, "It is already here." She looked at his face and saw something hidden behind his calm eyes. There was a storm inside him, something heavy, something painful. She sat down across from him and said, "Tell me who you are." He took a deep breath and said, "I used to work for them, the ones who built the labs, who hunted your kind, who called it science." He said, "I believed we were protecting Earth. I thought we were building defense, but I was wrong." He looked at his hands as if the memory was still alive in them. "I saw what they did to your people. I saw the cages, the tests, the fear. I could not take it anymore, so I ran and they called me a traitor." He pointed to the scars on his arms, thin and old like faded maps. "They tried to silence me, but I disappeared and built this place." She listened and felt something shift inside her, something new. She said, "They hurt me too. They made me forget things, but some memories still come in dreams. I see stars and voices. I see a ship falling from the sky and I hear a name. I do not know if it is mine." He said, "They erased parts of you because you carry something important. You are not just from the stars. You are a message, a warning, a key." She looked at him and whispered, "How do you know?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small clear crystal, glowing with soft light. "Because you are not the first," he said, and placed the crystal on the table. Inside the crystal was an image, a face just like hers but older. She said, "Who is that?" and he said her name was Sira. "She came before you. She tried to warn us, but no one listened. They took her and she never came back. You were the last one left." The girl touched the crystal and felt warmth and pain together. She closed her eyes and saw flashes of stars and fire and voices calling her name. They opened her eyes and whispered, "They are not just coming for me, they are coming for Earth." The man nodded slowly and said, "Yes, because what your kind feared is already here. They are using human hands to open doors that should never be opened." She said, "Then we have to stop them." He stood and walked to the wall where a strange black suit was hanging. It looked old and powerful with marks she did not understand. He said, "I have one last mission." She said, "We do it together." He looked at her and nodded. A sharp sound echoed through the air outside like thunder without clouds. He moved to the window and his face changed. "They are close," he said. She ran to the door and looked through the trees. Dark shapes were moving quickly through the forest. Not just men, but machines, flying low with red eyes, scanning the ground. The man pressed a button on the wall and the floor began to shift. Weapons rose from hidden places and lights flickered across the walls. The cabin was not just a home, it was a fortress. He handed her a weapon and said, "Stay close to me." She held it tight, though her hands trembled. He looked at her and said, "They think you are weak. Prove them wrong." She nodded and took her place beside him. Outside, the machines stopped moving. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then a voice came through a speaker outside. "You cannot hide forever. Give us the asset and we will not harm you." The man looked at her and said, "They are lying," she said. "I know." He looked at the door and whispered, "One last time, not again, not this time." The night returned faster than expected and the sky turned dark like spilled ink. The girl stood beside the man in silence as red lights flickered deep within the trees. She could hear machines humming in the distance and the soft crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. Inside the cabin, the air had changed and every wall seemed to breathe with hidden power. The man moved through the room with steady hands, touching panels, pressing buttons, unlocking secrets. Buried beneath the wooden floor, the cabin began to shift as walls opened and metallic arms unfolded from the ground. Screens lit up across the walls, showing images from outside. She saw figures moving through the forest wearing black armor with glowing visors and silent weapons. They were searching slowly, carefully, like hunters walking in the dark. The man turned to her and said, "This place was never meant to be a home. It was built to stop them if they ever came this far." She walked with him through a hidden door that led underground. Beneath the cabin was a tunnel filled with machines, tools, weapons, and a large screen glowing with maps of stars. She looked around with wide eyes and asked, "Did you build all this alone?" He said, "Not alone. A long time ago, a group of us saw what was coming. We planned in secret, hid everything in places no one would find. But now I am the only one left." She stepped closer to the map and pointed at one star. Blinking slowly, she said, "This is where I was born. He looked at the star and nodded slowly. Then he pulled up a new map showing Earth and a pattern of red lines spreading across it like veins. He said, they're already here. And they are not just soldiers, they are signals, programs, lies, hidden in networks waiting to open the final gate, she said. What gate? He pointed to the blinking star and said, the gate between your world and ours. Once opened, it cannot be closed. She felt a cold wave pass through her as if her blood remembered something she had forgotten. She said, I saw it once in my dreams, a great light, a broken sky, and voices screaming from the stars. He said, they want you because you are the key. She touched her chest and said how. He said, your body carries data, your blood carries coordinates, your mind carries the last warning. He showed her a device that pulsed with a soft white glow. He said, this will unlock the memory, but it may hurt. She nodded without fear and said, do it. He placed the device near her temple and closed his eyes. She felt heat and sound, and then her body went still. In her mind, stars rushed past her and a voice called her name. Not the name she knew, but the name she had forgotten. She saw a city made of glass floating in space, and then she saw fire consuming it. She saw her people sending her away in a ship and giving her a crystal and a message. She saw Earth below her, and then she saw the lab, the pain, the fear, the silence. Her eyes opened and she fell to her knees. Tears ran down her face, but her voice was strong. She said, I remember everything now. They erased it to make me a tool, but I was never a tool. I was a messenger. The man helped her stand and said, then it is time to deliver the message. Suddenly an explosion shook the ground and dust fell from the ceiling. An alarm screamed through the walls and the screens turned red. They have found the cabin. He ran to the upper level and she followed close behind. Outside, the trees were burning and machines moved like wolves through the flames. The man activated the defense grid and energy walls formed around the cabin. Towers rose from the ground and began firing bursts of light into the trees. The girl picked up a strange device from the wall and it lit up in her hands. It responded to a touch like it knew her. She stepped outside into the firelight and faced the soldiers coming closer. She said, I am not afraid of you. They raised their weapons, but before they could fire, she lifted her hand and the ground shook. Energy pulsed through her fingers and a wave of light pushed the soldiers back. The man stood beside her with his weapon ready and said, welcome back. She smiled for the first time and said, let them come. This place may look like a cabin, but it is the heart of something greater. It is a shield, a sword, a promise, and tonight it will become a legend. The night burned with fire and smoke as the trees around the cabin cracked and fell. The machines came in waves, their bodies black and cold, their eyes red with no feeling. The girl stood in front of the man with the strange weapon in her hand, and the wind pulling her hair like a storm, calling her name. She was no longer shaking, no longer hiding, no longer lost. She said, I remember the code. I remember the code. I remember the shield. I remember who I am. The man nodded and his voice was calm like a stone in the river. Then fight for what remembers you, he said. She ran forward into the smoke and light, and the machine saw her and opened fire. But she raised her hand, and the weapon in her grip came alive. It glowed with blue light that danced like stars, and then it fired a beam that tore the metal apart like paper. The machines tried to surround her, but the man activated the tower pulse and energy waves spread across the field. They had practiced this moment in their minds for years, but now it was real, and there was no turning back. She moved like she had done it before, like her body knew the rhythm of war. Each step, each turn, each strike felt like home, like memory returning in the shape of fire. The man covered her back and fired into the shadows, never missing, never speaking. He watched her and knew she was more than they ever feared. She was what they could never control. She reached the hill where the commander stood behind a shield of drones. He was not human. His voice came from a speaker inside the helmet, and he said, you were never meant to awaken. She answered, I was not meant to sleep. She raised the weapon and charged forward, and the shield broke under her light. The commander struck her with a blade that hissed with dark energy, and she fell for a second. The pain was real, but she was not broken. She stood again, and her eyes glowed brighter than before. She said, this world is not yours, and neither am I. She struck the ground, and a wave of light burst from her feet, sending every machine into silence. The forest stopped screaming, and the fire turned to ash. The man climbed the hill and saw her standing above the wreckage, her breath steady, her hands shaking not from fear but from the weight of memory. He said, they will send more. She said, let them. She turned and looked at the cabin still standing tall behind the smoke, its light still shining through the dark. This place, she said, it woke something in me, not just power but purpose. He said, it is yours now if you want it. She looked at him and said, not alone. They walked back to the cabin as the stars came out above them, one by one like old friends blinking after a long sleep. Inside the cabin, the screens flickered and one of them showed a signal, a code, sent through deep space calling out to someone or something. She touched the screen and her face changed. She said, I know this frequency. It is for my people. He asked, what does it say? She said, it says, we are not too late. He stepped back and gave her space. She stood in front of the console and placed the crystal in the center. The lights dimmed and a soft voice spoke in her language. She closed her eyes and listened, and tears rolled down her face. She said, they are alive. They are hiding and they are waiting, but they cannot wait forever. He asked, what do they need? She said, a beacon, a protector, a fighter who remembers. He said, then they have one. She turned to him and said, "You saved me when I was just a shadow. Now I will fight for this world and for the one I left behind." He said, "Then this is only the beginning." She walked outside and looked at the stars. One of them blinked brighter and she raised her hand. Toward it she said, "I am ready." Behind her the cabin stood, strong, not just a home but a shield for the future. The trees whispered with new life and the wind carried her name like a promise. She no longer feared the sky, the machines, the silence. She had found her voice, her strength, her reason. She was not just from the stars, she was now part of Earth, and she would protect it with all that she was and all that she would become. The sky was quiet again. But silence does not always bring peace. The girl sat near the fire, staring into the flames as memories burned brighter inside her mind. The man stood by the window with his hand resting on the weapon that never left his side. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place but more like a waiting room before something greater. She spoke without turning and said, "I saw something in the signal, something they did not want me to know." He looked at her and waited because he had always known this moment would come. She said, "The signal was not just from my people, it was mixed with Earth codes." She turned and faced him and her eyes were not soft, they were sharp and heavy. She said, "It was sent from the same base where I was taken. The same place you escaped." He looked at her but said nothing. She stepped closer and said, "You told me, you saved me." He said, "I did." She said, "You were part of the team that created me." His silence was louder than any answer. She said, "Say it." He said, "Yes." She stepped back and the fire cracked like something breaking in the dark. "You were one of them," she said, and her voice trembled with rage and sorrow. He said, "I tried to stop it, I tried to shut it down." She said, "But you helped build it first." He nodded slowly. "I did not know what they planned," he said. "I thought we were building protection, not prisons," she said. "And what about me? Was I protection or a weapon?" He said. "You were hope." She turned away and clenched her fists. She said, "They took everything from me. My memories, my people, my voice, and now I find the only one I trusted helped make the machine that broke me." He said, "I never stopped fighting for you." She said, "I cannot trust your fight if your hands built the chains." Outside, the wind rose and the trees bent low like they too felt the weight of the truth. He walked to the table and placed a small device. On it, he said, "This holds every file, every mission, every secret from that program. You want to know who you are? Then take it." She looked at the device but did not move. He said, "I am not your enemy." She said, "Maybe not, but you are not my savior either." She picked up the device and walked into the lower room where the machines hummed like whispers in the dark. The screen lit up and data flowed like a river, images, names, experiments, numbers, all tied to her. She saw her own face on a file marked Asset E3 Hybrid. Her hands shook as the screen revealed more. A video began to play. She saw herself, younger, confused, crying behind a glass wall. She saw the man watching through the glass with sorrow in his eyes. Then the video glitched and another face appeared, a scientist speaking in hushed tones. "This one is the key," he said. "If we can unlock her mind, we can control both skies and stars." The girl turned off the screen and walked back upstairs. She found the man sitting in silence, the fire almost gone. She said, "I saw what you saw." He looked at her and said, "And now?" She said, "I do not forgive you. Not now, maybe not ever, but I will fight with you because Earth still needs us." He nodded and said, "That is enough." Before she could speak again, a loud crash shook the cabin and lights flickered. The screens lit up with red alerts and a voice echoed through the hallway. "Unidentified breach detected." The girl grabbed her weapon and looked at the man. He said, "This is not like before." She said, "I feel it too." They ran outside and saw a black figure walking through the smoke. It was not like the others. Its body shifted like shadows and its voice was many voices in one. It said, "You cannot stop what has already begun." The girl raised her hand, and light pulsed from her skin, but the figure absorbed it like smoke drinks air. The man fired, but the bullets passed through like wind through cloth. The girl shouted, "This is not a machine," he said. "Then what is it?" She said, "It is the gate itself. It is the crack between here and there, and it came through me." The figure smiled with eyes made of night and said, "Yes. Little key, you opened the door long ago, and now we will walk through." The ground trembled as the figure stepped closer, and the air turned cold like winter had swallowed the forest. The girl stood between the man and the creature with light rising from her hands, like fire being born from starlight. The trees bent back and the wind screamed through the valley like it knew something ancient had returned. The man raised his weapon, but the creature spoke with many voices and said, "Your tools cannot harm what is already beyond form." The girl said, "I know what you are now. You are the echo that follows the scream. You are the shadow that slips through the lock, and you used me to find the door." The creature moved without sound and its body shifted like fog and smoke. It said, "You carry the coordinates in your blood, you carry the code in your breath, and now the gate is open because you remembered." The girl closed her eyes and whispered something in her forgotten language. The sky above them flickered with stars that did not belong to this world. The man said, "We still have a choice. We can close it, we can end it." She opened her eyes and her voice was steady like steel pulled from flame. "Then we do it." Now the figure laughed and the sound broke the air like glass. It said, "You can try, but you will lose more than your lives. You will lose your world." The girl stepped forward and the ground under her feet began to glow with ancient symbols. She said, "This planet is not yours, its soil is not yours, its sky is not yours, and I will not let you take it." The man pulled a small crystal from his jacket and held it tightly. He said, "If we destroy this, it will cut the signal." The link between her and them will be gone. The creature lunged, but the girl blocked its path with a wall of light. She said, "Go now." He looked at her and said, "I am not leaving you," she said. "You must. You gave me a second life. Now I give you the chance to protect this one." He reached out and touched her shoulder and said, "I was supposed to save the world, but I choose you." She smiled, and there was sorrow in her eyes, but also peace. She said, "Then help me finish it." They ran back into the cabin as the ground split open behind them and tendrils of darkness reached out like hungry roots inside the cabin. The lights flickered, and the machine sparked with wild energy. The girl placed her hands on the console, and the room filled with light. The crystal began to crack in the man's hand, and he said, "Once this breaks, there is no going back." She said, "I know to it." The crystal shattered, and the signal screamed through the walls. The creature howled outside, and the stars above them burned red. The man fell to one knee, and the girl screamed as the power surged through her body. She saw her people in the stars. Watching, she saw Earth below her waiting. She saw the child she used to be crying in the lab, and she said no more. The cabin shook, and the machines exploded in sparks. The girl rose into the air, and her body glowed like the sun behind clouds. The creature broke through the wall, but before it could reach her, the gate closed with a final flash of light. The stars stopped burning, the wind stopped screaming, and the forest stood still again. She fell to the ground, and the man caught her. The body was weak, but her eyes were calm. She said, "It is over." He said, "We did it." She said, "No, you did. You gave me the choice. And I chose to be more than what they made me." He held her close as the cabin burned and the sky turned blue once more, and the distance machines fell silent, and the red lights faded. The world had been saved, but not by power, by choice, by memory, by hope. He carried her out into the morning light and laid her gently on the grass. She looked at him and said, "Promise me something." He said, "Anything," she said. "If they come again, teach them not to fear but to choose." He nodded and held her hand as the sun rose over the trees. Later the cabin would be ashes, the machines would rust, the files would fade, but the story would remain, of the girl who fell from the stars and the man who chose her over the world.